All right, so let's go to John chapter 1. And just a reminder what we talked about last week for introduction, okay? And then when we talk about these things, we need to recognize our presuppositions. What are we presupposing when we're coming to our Bible study, when we're coming to study the Bible? What are our main presuppositions? We want to identify those to make sure we're interpreting it correctly, and we want to identify our presuppositions. And so the first presupposition is when we study the Scriptures, at least this Bible study, is that we're saying that the Scriptures do not contradict each other, okay? So if they don't contradict, and there's something that seems contradictory, we need to find a way to harmonize them the best way we can to see what is the author trying to intend, okay? What is the author's intent? Next thing we need to look at is we believe in monotheism, that there is only one God. So when we look at things that might seem, especially today, might seem to contradict that, how do we approach that? How do we handle those things? So there's only one God. Scriptures don't contradict. And the last thing, which we spent some time on last week as well, is that it was called Hebrew logic, or we call box logic. And we talked about how sometimes our knowledge of things, or we have to hold intention because everything's a revelation from God. What's in this box may make perfect sense, and what's in this box might make perfect sense. But when we try to put those two boxes together, it doesn't always work, and that's okay. And we talked about why that is and how that works with Hebrew logic versus Greek logic. But we're not going to spend too much time on that. We'll probably bring that up if you want to be reminded of that as we go on. But right now I want to jump into John chapter 1, because like I said, we have a lot to cover. And okay, so John chapter 1, the overview here is, like I said last week, it contains all the themes of the rest of the book and the lens and how the rest of the book should be interpreted. So we're going to spend a lot of time. The time we're spending in these first 18 verses, we're not going to spend this much time in the rest of the book, so don't get too worried or concerned. But we want to spend time on these first 18 verses because, like I said, this is the lens. And every time we finish a section or chapter in the book of John, we're going to go back to the first 18 verses and see the themes of what we can compare to the first 18 verses. Because essentially, like I said last week, the first 18 verses is just a summary of the whole entire book of John. And so we can see these themes. We have to look from things from a thematic perspective. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing. And so I broke down John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18 into three sections. Okay, 1 through 5 is the first section. John 1, 6 through 13 is the second section. And my new favorite section now is 14 through 18, which I don't even know if we're going to get there today. We'll see. Okay, and so when we look at John chapter 1, John chapter 1 is primarily making reference to two sections in the Tanakh, or it's more specifically in the Torah. The first one is going to be quite obvious. The second one is not so obvious. I've been testing my friends to see if they can get the second one, and only one person will be able to find it after many, many hints. So, which is pretty fascinating. So we'll get there if we have time today. I just want to read you a short introduction of the book of John. I think this will set the tone for what we're about to study today. Okay? It says, I wonder how long it took. Surely it wasn't something that was written carelessly, without planning, without thought. He must have spent a good deal of time and energy on it. I refer to the prologue of John, the first 18 verses of the gospel that bears his name. Some people are a little uncomfortable with the idea that one of the writers of the Scriptures working hard on a particular passage, a special section. There are others that think that the writers of the Bible must have gone into some kind of trance while being led by the Spirit to speak God's truth. But such is not a truly biblical idea. These holy men indeed spoke from God, but that does not exclude all these uses of highest efforts to present God's truth. I get some verses there. The prologue of John is a literary masterpiece. Its balance is almost unparalleled. It is carefully crafted work of art, a revelation that has inspired believers for almost 2,000 years. The brightest minds have been fascinated by it and have always marveled at its beauty. It's an inexhaustible treasure. Few passages of Scripture are more important to our study, to the Trinity, and in particular, the person of the Son, than the prologue of John. You see, John clearly intended this passage to function as a lens, a window of sorts through which we are to read the first of his gospel. If we stumble here, we are in danger of missing so much of the richness that is found in the rest of the book. But if we work hard to grasp John's meaning here, many other passages will open up for us of their own accord, yielding tremendous insights into the heart of God's revelation of himself in the Messiah Yeshua. Okay. So I hope that gets you ready and hunger for what we're about to go in here. So let's just look at the first 5 verses, and we're going to break it down slowly. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness does not comprehend it. Okay, so let's look at it from a macro perspective. Let's look from an overall perspective. What do we see first when we read this? What comes to our mind when we read this section? Well, the first thing we should be understanding is when we see the words like in the beginning, all things came into being, life, right? Light, darkness. We should be thinking of Genesis chapter 1, right? Does everyone see that? That's pretty easy to grasp. That's an easy one. So in Genesis 1:1, we're introduced to the Creator God, but in John, we're introduced to the Creator of the Word, right? Interesting. So when we look at in the beginning, there's some dispute. Like I said, I'm coming from more of an apologetics perspective that people try to deny the deity of Yeshua. They try to say, well, in the beginning is not referring to the Genesis. It's referring to the beginning of his ministry, or they try to make the beginning anything else. But I say, okay, fine. That doesn't matter, because what I'm about to show you in John chapter 1 is irrelevant. How you define what the beginning is. So just keep your eye on the ball. What is the purpose of the book of John? Specifically, what is the purpose of the book of John chapter 1? It's to show who the Word is, right? It's all about the Word. And so we need to keep our eye on the ball of that being the case, because if we take that eye off the ball, we're going to miss some of the things that we want to see, what John is trying to communicate to us. Some have also said that this section of John is referring to wisdom, like John chapter 8. And it's very possible too, but the only problem with that is that John doesn't mention wisdom again anywhere else in his gospel. So even though it's very similar to Proverbs chapter 8, he doesn't really bring it up again. So that's left for you to decide if that's the case or not. Okay. All right. So the question is, why does John use the word word? In the beginning was the Word. The logos, right? The Greek word is for logos. Also can mean logic. Why does John use the word as opposed to something else? Well, let's look at some reasons here. From a Greek philosophical perspective, the term was used as an explanation regarding the functioning of the world. It was used as an important ordering force that gave harmony to the universe, very similar to logic. The Greeks were very much into logic, and so they thought this logos was this idea as to what gave the word form and understanding. So, but they viewed logic as an impersonal force of what held the world together. And so some people might be thinking that, okay, well, John is, maybe writing to the Greeks or the Gentiles, and he's using his word as a way of introducing them to God, the Word. That's possible. But let's not forget from the Hebraic perspective, right? John's background, he's a monotheistic Jew in the first century. So from a Jewish perspective, the term took on a deep significance, meaning the word logos, the Word. In times before Yeshua, Jews would use such words as the word of the Lord or the wisdom of God in reference to a personal concept. A personal concept. A good parallel verse would be Psalm 33:6, where it says, "By Adonai's word were the heavens made, and by their host of his breath of his mouth." So God breathes, right? God spoke, and the world came to be, as we'll see here in John chapter 1. And so So when God speaks, his powerful word creates. The same word effects deliverance and judgment, as we see in Isaiah 55:11. So when God, the word, so we talked about the word of the Lord coming, right? It says here, when God speaks to Isaiah, it says, this is Isaiah 38:4. When God speaks to Isaiah, he says, the word of the Lord came to Isaiah. The word of the Lord came to Isaiah. So let's look at another example here. When the people are sick and are about to die, God says in Psalm 107:20, send forth the word and heal them. He rescued them from the grave. So God sent forth his word, and that's how they were healed. And so from in the early first century, even at the time of Yeshua, everyone heard of the Targums? The Targums, everyone know what the Targums are? The Targums were, I guess the best way to put it is the New Living Translation, or the Living Translation, like a paraphrase of the Tanakh. And so they would sometimes, whenever God would interact with his creation in kind of a physical way, they would use the word memra to replace the word for God or God himself when he's interacting with his creation. And so memra means the word, I think if I'm not correct. Yes, okay. Memra means the word. So they would change. So given that idea of the word of the Lord, the memra of the Lord, right? It was the physical action of the personification of God when he's interacting with creation. This is why, most likely why John uses the word word. Okay? So I just want to read this just short quote from a scholar. How should we understand this word? In short, God's quote-unquote word in the Tanakh is his powerful self-expression in creation, revelation, salvation, and the personification of the word makes it suitable for John to apply it to the title of God's ultimate self-disclosure, the person in his own Son. But if this expression would prove the richest to the Jewish readers, it would also resonate with the minds of some readers entirely within pagan backgrounds. In their case, however, they would soon discover that whatever they had understood the term to mean in the past, the author whose work they were reading was forcing them into a fresh thought. So it doesn't matter if you're looking from a pagan perspective or a Jewish perspective. John is going beyond those and identifying who this word is. Right? This word is going to be personal and as a creator. So that's one of the reasons why John uses the word word. Now, another issue we have to deal with before we really get into it is when we read in our English translations, we see the word him. But that's not exactly what the Greek word said. Right? The Greek word could be translated as it. The word is an it. And so those who try to deny the deity of Yeshua or try to say that the Logos is merely just an idea, impersonal idea that God had, they try to say, well, it should be translated word it. And so as we go through it, let's keep that in mind. Because literally what it is that it's a demonstrative pronoun, which really means that one or this one. Always pointing back to the word. That's really how it should be translated. But in our English translations, that's just kind of tiresome to say. But the context is pretty clear that it is a person. And the proof of that we'll see when we get down to verses 10 and 11, when he says he came to his own. An impersonal idea doesn't come to his own. An impersonal idea doesn't own anything, right? And we'll see more examples of that as we get later on the prologue. So how should we translate the word it? Well, it's interesting here. If you look at verse 5, it says, the light shines in the darkness, and the dark does not comprehend it. Well, that's the same Greek word as the word for him. Remember, it means that one. That's what it's referring to. So just keep in mind, if somebody brings that up, how should we understand this word? Now, what's interesting is that same Greek word that's translated it or he is also in reference to John in verse 6. So John is not an it, it's a he as well. So it's a demonstrative pronoun pointing back to the subject, which is the word. That's just something to keep in mind. Okay? So as we will see, John used the word, we should look at the word with a capital W, as a name and not merely a description. So I'm going to have to prove that to you, which I hope you'll be able to do. Now, the last thing, before we get into it, is I want to look at the little word that is was. The word was. Now, in the English language, the word was is a very mundane word. It's not very exciting. It's just a verb to express something that's happening in the past. But in the Greek, it's very rich. It's a very rich word, and there's really no way to translate it good in the English. So what I want to do is I want to focus in on that because this is a major theme in the Prologue of John, this word was. And the word was, as we'll see, is very important, especially for the first verse. Okay? So it's going to be highlighted in green throughout the book of John so we can see its function and what it works. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take John 1:1 and we're going to break it down into 3 separate sections, and we're going to dissect it and looking at the word was and how this affects our meaning on John 1:1. How are we doing? Anybody, any questions so far before we move on? Okay, so let's look at John 1:1. In the beginning, yes. Question?
A little while ago you said that the word is the same word that was used in the book of Isaiah when he was talking about like 3 things. I can't remember what those 3 things were, like deliverance.
Yeah, well, in other words, the deliverance, judgment, salvation, the word of the Lord came, the word of the Lord healed them, those kind of things. It's mentioning the word of the Lord is doing this. And so it's...
So those are different things the word did. Those
yes.
are not different words for the word.
No, yeah, not different. Yeah, so okay. The word is going to be kind of hard. So yes, then the same word, but it's the word is doing different things.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, so let's jump right into it. In the beginning was the Word. John was written in Greek, so we're looking at the Greek word was in specifically John 1:1. The Greek word for was here and throughout the prologue is en. All right, this is important, is en. The tense is an imperfect indicative and expresses a continual action in the past. So let me give you an example if you don't know what an imperfect indicative is, okay? So the imperfect tense generally represents a continuous action repeated in the past. So where the present tense might indicate they were asking, the imperfect tense would indicate they kept on asking. Right? You see how that works? They kept on asking in the past, and the imperfect as not only did it happen in the past continually, but it brings it up to the present. So, for example, when I said I married my wife 14 years ago, I would use the imperfect tense because not only did I marry her in the past, I'm still married her today. So it's a past action that has continuous ramifications even up to today. Okay, that's the imperfect tense. So what he's saying here is that the Greek word for was and throughout is continuing action in the past. Now, what's so interesting about this is when en, the meaning for a word was, is used with a time from the beginning, it is meant to express that the word existed before the beginning. Interesting. Okay? The word existed before the beginning. So no matter how far you want to push back the beginning, the word is always existing before the beginning. So you want to push back the very beginning, the word existed before that. So a good, more paraphrased translation of this section would say this. The New English Bible says, when all things began, the word already was. Okay? So it just in this section alone, John is trying to say that this... So what is John trying to communicate here? If the word exists before the beginning, what does that say about the word? The word is eternal, right? The word has no beginning because he's before the beginning. Okay? So that's just the first half of John 1. But let's continue the rest of the verse to see how it all fits together. And the word was with God. Okay? Now, the Greek word for with here is pros. And it has a wide range of meaning, but in this context, between persons, it is in reference to a personal relationship or intimacy. And we see this in other verses in the Bible where it's in 1 Corinthians 13:12, it says, and we shall see him face to face, pros. Face to face. So literally what you can translate this is, and the word was face to face with God, which would imply relationship. Which, if it's a relationship, you don't have a relationship with inanimate objects or an idea. You have a relationship with persons, right? That's what the word pros seems to imply here. And there are many more examples to be given with this word pros. So it says, together with the word was, John is telling us that the word has always had an eternal face-to-face relationship with God. Right? If he existed always before the beginning, and he's always been with God, what does that say about the relationship with him and God? Okay. But see, now we have a problem. We're monotheism. We're monotheists. But this doesn't seem to imply that there's two, not one? How do we reconcile that? Remember our presuppositions. Well, let's finish it off. Right? Then he says here, and the word was God. The problem here, and this is what many people get distracted here, the problem here is how to understand the word God. All right? This is a predicate nominative construction, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So remember that the prologue is not trying to attempt to show who God is, but who the Word is. That's the point of John 1, to show who God, to show who Word is, not who God is. Okay? So therefore, the final part of this verse is emphasizing the nature of the Word. So John is saying that the Word shares the very nature and being of God. And so there's a problem, especially when we talk to Jehovah's Witnesses about this, right? Or those like, they'll say, well, there's no article in front of God. So literally it says, and God was the Word. That's literally what it says, but the subject is the Word. And so they say, well, because there's no article, the, in front of God, therefore, it's not referring to God, it's maybe referring to his deity or something along those lines. The problem with that is that the most of the time the word God is used in the scriptures, the word article is not there. So even when we get down to verse 13, we're all children of God. There's no article in front of it either. So how does that work? But what's interesting is that in the Jehovah's Witnesses Bible, they'll say, and the word was a God. Because they're trying to say, well, there's no article there, so he's just a little God. But then that makes two of them, and that's a totally different being. But be that as it may, we can go into a lot more detail on how this stuff works. But I wanted to read this. It says, if John was to put the article the in front of God in Greek, then he would have been saying that God and the Word are interchangeable, and that can't be the case. So in other words, if God was to say the God was the Word, then he can say the Word is the God. But they can't be interchangeable, and we'll see here why. In John 4:16, in 1 John 4:16, he is not, when he's saying that love, when we say God is love, right? We don't want to say that love is God, because not all love is God, right? God is not love. When we say God is love, we're saying it's an attribute of who God is, right? God's attribute is love, but we don't want to say that the attribute of love is God. They're not interchangeable. So, in other words, if John was to put the article in front of God here, then he would be saying that everything God is the Word and the Word is God interchangeable, and we can't do that because that would contradict what he just said earlier, when the Word is with God, right? So that's why the article is not there. He's being very careful on how that works. So here, John is describing something or qualitative case who the Word is as by his nature. Okay, and so the NEB paraphrases it this way: what God was, the Word was. That's a good paraphrase of what he's trying to say here. Now, if you ever have an opportunity to talk to Jehovah's Witnesses, do not, and I want to repeat and stress this, do not bring up this verse with a Jehovah's Witness. And the reason why is not because you don't have any good argument, is not that you can't debate them, is that they've heard this verse 100,000 times so much that their brain just shuts off and they'll just repeat the mantra that they've been told, and they won't listen to anything you have to say. So don't bring up this verse. There's other more bulletproof verses that you can bring using their own translation that when we have time sometime I'll show you that we can use that will knock their socks off, but don't bring up this verse because you're not going to get anywhere with them, most likely, okay? So don't bring up this verse. But again, that's essentially how the Greek was wording the article. If you hear about the articles, you don't want to interchange the word and God together in this verse because it will contradict itself. Okay, so in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. These are all the same tenses, the imperfect past tense of the word en. Okay. So in just 17 Greek words, John communicates three things. One, the Word is eternal. The Word has always existed and did not come into existence at a point in time. Two, John is trying to say that the Word is personal, right? He is not a force, but a person. And in that eternally, he has always been in communion with the Father. And three, the Word is deity as to his nature, right? The Word is God as far as his nature is concerned. Okay? That's a lot to say in just 17 Greek words, right? Can you do any better than that? Can you communicate that much in just smaller water words? Remember, this is just going into John. This is the lens of how we're supposed to interpret the rest of the chapter. But that's not even the good part. I mean, I thought that was pretty good, but then when I started reading the prologue of John, there's some better stuff later on, which I hope we get to. Okay. Is there any questions or comments to that before we move on? Okay. Hope I was clear about how the article worked. I know that could be kind of confusing, but it's a little more in depth that we can spend some time on. Okay. John chapter 2, verses 2 and 3 says, "He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being." Now, notice the word "was" is being consistent here. It's the same Greek tense, same Greek word. He, or we just literally say that one, meaning the Word, that one was in the beginning with God. So verses 2 and 3 is re-emphasizing verse 1. It's kind of repetitive, but it's making sure you got his point across when you look at verse 1. So verse 2 then says that the Word has an eternal relationship with God from the beginning. Everyone see that? He was in the beginning with God. So he's kind of repeating that. But verse 3 is saying something different, but it's emphasizing the same thing. Here's what it says. Verse 3 says that the Word created everything that had a beginning. Then, if that's true, then the Word must not have had a beginning. So if the Word creates everything that had a beginning, what does it say about the Word? That it's eternal, right? He's eternal, that he doesn't have a beginning. Everyone see this? So positively it's saying, through him all things were created. Negatively saying, without him, nothing that has been made. So in the Greek is very, very clear here. When it says nothing, not one thing is literally what it says. Not one thing that has come into being has not been come into being through the Word. So everything came through the Word. That has had a beginning. So therefore the Word couldn't have had a beginning because everything that had a beginning came through the Word. Does that make sense? All right. But there's more. All right. So when we look at verse 3 again, it says, note the contrast between the word was, en, and that was in the beginning, and everything else came into being. Agenata. Agenata is the word. Agenata, at a point in time. Now, why is this in case? Because we're going to see these words pit against each other, not only in the prologue, but throughout the book of John. We're going to see this agenata word over and over again because John is trying to emphasize between the Word and everything else. We're going to see this theme coming up over and over again. Agenata. Agenata. Okay? So note the contrast. The Word was with God, but everything else came into being. If verse 1 is saying what God was, what God is, the Word is, what do you think, as far as his nature is concerned, what do you think verse 3 is trying to say? What do you think verse 3 is trying to say? Verse 3 is trying to say what God does, the Word does. Right? Now, I want you to pause for a second and think, because remember, as we go through the prologue, we're supposed to be thinking, how do these themes of what John is trying to say here relate to the rest of the book? Now, can anybody just think off the top of their head what God does, the Word does? Where have we heard that before in the book of John? That's mentioned several times in several chapters, right? What God does, the Word does. What the Father does, the Son does. Have you heard that before? Is that familiar with you in the book of John? Yes, it does. That's where I got it from.
If you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
Well,
No.
that's not. Yes, he's reflecting the Father, but I'm not talking about what he's seen. I'm talking about what he does specifically. I don't know, John chapter 5, right? My Father is working on the Sabbath. I too am working on the Sabbath, right? And he elaborates that even more. So John is setting all this up for what we read later. He's going to elaborate it more specifically later on. So what God is, the Word is, and what God does, the Word does. Because remember, only God can create. Nothing else can create but God. And so if the Word is a creator, he creates, what does it say about the Word? Right? Yes.
So I'm trying to find where it says all things came into being through him, and I'm looking at the King James. It says in King James it says all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. The reason
Yes. It's the same thing.
right, but I'm looking for that word agenita.
Well, agenita, that's the Greek word. I'm putting the Greek word in there.
Oh, I know that, but this has the Greek.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I can't find the Greek word in
Yeah,
this.
it says all things came into being.
No, it says all things were made by him.
Right, the made part should be agenita.
Made is genomi.
Yes, that is a form of agenita.
Oh, okay.
In other words, it's an aorist tense of. It's like you have a word in English, and then you have a different spelling when it has different tenses.
Right.
In
I
Greek.
forget what that's called.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank
So
you.
yes, I'm just putting the exact
Conjugation.
tense. And yes, the congregation. There you go.
Okay. Conjugation.
Okay. All right. So therefore, in the gospel, what Yeshua does is divine activity. When Yeshua heals or speaks, when he gives eternal life, this is God at work, just as God worked from the foundation of the world. Okay. All right. Any questions on that? Okay. So starting in verse 4, it says, in him was life. In him was life. Remember, past tense. It's always in him has always been life. In him was life, and that life was the light of mankind. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness does not comprehend the light or it. Okay? Now, there's some questions we need to dive deeper into this because John is being ambiguous, and I think he's being ambiguous here on purpose. Because like I said last week, even though the prologue of John is the lens of how we're supposed to view the rest of the Bible, the rest of the book of John, sometimes he leaves things ambiguous so that the rest of the book of John can interpret the prologue. And here's one of the cases where I think is the case. Okay. So in him was life, and that life was the light of mankind. What is this life that John is making reference to? Is it the self-existing life, or is it eternal life, referring to salvation? What do you think? Which life was John making reference to? Can be both. Why do you say both? The mic. You need the mic.
I admit I'm coming at it from a bias because it's affirming my belief that I already have, but I would think that it would. Yeah, it's what I already believe, so that's why I think it means that.
Okay, but I was saying from a contextual perspective, what might we think that it's referring to both? Well, remember the context is when we read John 1, the prologue. What are we getting? We're getting from Genesis, right?
Right.
So therefore, we think of the creation narrative of God creating life, self-existing life. So that makes sense. But what's interesting that is when we read the rest of the book of John, whenever he mentions life in the book of John, it's always in reference to what? Spiritual, eternal life. So again, John seems to be having a double meaning here. And this is what I'm saying, is that we need the rest of the book to help us understand this. Go ahead.
I think it's in reference to life, but I think it's in reference to life that is untarnished by the curse of sin.
Okay.
So, by definition, it's in reference to eternal life, because life untarnished by the curse of sin is eternal.
Right.
So that's my thought.
Now, this life, then, he equates life to what? He equates life to what? To light. Life equals light. Now, it's great when John starts to giving these understandings of these things. When he starts, his phrases, light and life are the same. Because that helps us sometimes decode what he wants to say later on. So we got to keep that in mind. Life and light are the same. So if life is life, and then he mentions darkness, what is the opposite of darkness then? Well, what is darkness? Death. So we see how we made these conclusions, that darkness, death, life, light, okay? We have to keep these things in mind. John is assuming that you're following along with his patterns here. Okay? Now, it is unclear what John means by light of mankind. When he says, in him was life, and this life was the light of mankind, not quite sure what he's saying here. We have to wait until later to figure that out. But is he referring to the image of God when he says this life and this light is the light of man? Is he referring to general revelation? Is he referring to the revelation of the coming of the Son? We don't know, because he's just keeping it ambiguous. But it is not the purpose now to understand this, but the source of this life and light is the purpose for the human race. So whatever this purpose of this light and life is for the human race, knowing that John just wants to know the source of it. That's all we know for now. And again, we're going to come back to this later as we go through the book of John to fill in the holes.
Hey, Aaron?
Yes.
So I'm sorry, but my brain is just like going crazy.
Okay.
So you can go online and you can search, and you will find scientific articles that say that at the point of conception, life begins with a burst of light. Right now, and then secondly, a lot of the most newest alternative health type stuff is based on light healing. So, anyway,
yeah,
it's fascinating.
The other thing we're going to look at is light shining in darkness is most likely making reference to Yeshua entering the world. When Yeshua entered the world, it's the light coming into the world, right? We've heard that as a theme throughout the book of John as well. So a lot of people think that John doesn't talk about Yeshua entering the world until verse 14, but that's not the case. Here is making reference to Yeshua entering the world before that, okay? So if that's the case, then how do we deal with the word it? Well, it did not enter the world. Yeshua entered the world. The person, the word entered the world. So that's just an idea that how we should translate the word him. Okay. Darkness cannot comprehend or understand it, or is it overpowered? Now, look at your translations. How does your translation say, and the darkness did not comprehend it? What are some other translations that might say that there? Darkness did not overcome it. Okay. What else? What are some translations? So darkness has not suppressed it. Okay. What else? Anything else? Anything else interesting? Overpowered. Okay. Overtake. Some translations would say that did not understand it, right? Did not understand it. So the reason why there's so many different diversions of different translations trying to understand this word, this Greek word here, is because it's very ambiguous. It can mean multiple things. And that's actually good for us. Because John is probably trying to convey what it means. Because when the light enters the world, what do we see? It means conflict. Conflict. When the light enters the world, conflict happens. Now, why is a conflict happening? It's because the darkness, when they're confronted with the light, they don't understand it. And as a result of not understanding this light, conflict happens. And this conflict, the darkness tries to overcome or to suppress or try to override this light, but is unable to. So that's a theme throughout the book of John again, right? Yeshua enters the world. Those he talks to are constantly misunderstanding what he's saying, right? And then what's the result of this misunderstanding? They want to kill him, and they eventually do. But even though they do, they were still not able to put out the light. And that's kind of the theme we talked about last week of this kind of summary of the book of John here. Okay. So again, we want to keep this in mind with the book of, this is one of the major themes of the book of John. Don't understand and unable to overcome. So it can mean both here. Okay. So there's conflict with the light and darkness. Okay. And the question is why? Why is there conflict with the light and darkness? Well, we're not told here. But that's something I want you to think about as we go through, because this is, again, another important. Why doesn't the light is so clear and it shines and everything and it makes, reveals everything. Why doesn't the darkness say, wow, okay, I can see now. That makes sense. Why isn't it that easy? Right. Well, it is. It is as simple. She said that the light. Yeah, I was just going to repeat is that the light doesn't want anything, the darkness doesn't want anything to do with the light. And that's true. The question is why. Right? I mean, it's easy to say, and I think that's true, but the question I want to dig deeper is that the darkness does not want anything to do with the light. Why? Right? So we're gonna dig deeper into that when we get later. All right, let's continue on. John 1:6-13. There came a man sent from God, whose name was John. He was a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not that light, but he came to testify about the light. There was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. He was the light of the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor the will of flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. Okay, so let's break this down. Let's break down this section here. So immediately what I want you to look at here is look at what it says about John. There came a man sent from John, a geneta, right? There came. John came into being. He came on the scene. So John is not eternal. Okay. He came there was a man sent from God whose name was John. Now, this is referring to John the Baptist, not John the writer. Okay? He came as a witness to testify about the light. Now, what's interesting about in the Greek here is witness and testify are very similar. So it's almost like if you were to read it this way, he came as a witness to witness about the light. Okay? So this is going to be a witness theme that we're going to see popping up over and over again throughout the book of John. And we'll see how this theme works as we get there. So verses 6-8 is the theme of the witness to testify. When you say somebody's being a witness and going to testify, what is the first thing that comes into your mind? A courtroom scene. So do you think we're going to see some courtroom scenes in the book of John? Yes. And so we need to recognize when John is using this literary idea of witness and testifying in the book of John, he's putting in a courtroom scene. So we're like those who are sitting in the back looking at the courtroom scene take place. And so we need to recognize that that's part of John's genre here later on in the book of John. Okay. Now it says here, how should we translate verse 9? Verse 9, if you look at your translations, it's going to be translated differently. So some translations might say, coming into the world, we're referring to every man, or is coming into the world making reference to the light. That's a translation issue. I don't know what the King James says. I think the King James says that it might say, and the light lights every man coming into the world. Okay. Well, I think the best translation to understand this coming into the world would make reference to the light. Because every time coming into the world is after John is making reference to coming into the world, is making reference to the Son coming into the world. So it doesn't talk about every man coming into the world. So just keep in mind that can be confusing when it talks about every man there. So that's actually what I was going to say in my notes is here. When it talks about true light, it's not contrasting true light with false light. It's talking about true light as the genuine light, right? Because it's trying to say that John is not the light, but the genuine light, what is truly light, is the Word, okay? And so also in John, this idea of true is not always contrasted with false, but true is an ultimate or genuine. Okay? So that's the idea, is that there's only one light source, the light is from the Messiah. So any light or life. By the way, I forgot to mention this earlier. In him was life. Was that something that just he was given life later on, or he always had the self-generating light in himself? Right? He's a source. He's the ultimate source of life in and of itself. He's always had this light because he's eternal. Okay, so this idea of the true life, the true light, same thing. Okay, is that a question? Yeah.
I would say this is introducing the concept or the motif of the reflection of the light that believers are supposed to be. It's like John wasn't the light; he was a reflection of the light. He witnessed, or he was testifying.
He was the what?
He was a reflection.
He was the reflection?
He was a reflection of it.
Keep that in mind for later.
So the light, you know what I'm saying, although, like, if you was outside and you saw a mirror and the mirror was flashing a light at you, you would think from a distance that the mirror was the actual light source. We think the moon is the actual light source, but the moon is not the light source. The moon is just reflecting the sun. A mirror is just reflecting the light source. And John was reflecting the source of light, which is Messiah.
Right. Okay. And so when they have to look at the meaning of enlightens, when it says here that the light enlightens every man, what does that mean to enlighten? What does that mean to enlighten? Now, enlighten can mean to give an inward knowledge of, right? Like he enlightened the meaning, give you knowledge. It's internal. Or it could be something, an objective revelation, to shed light upon, to make visible, to bring to light. So I think what enlighten here means, and then it could be both, but I think enlighten means to shed light upon, to visibly show what's going on. And I think that goes along with the theme in John chapter 3 and some other places where it talks about the light coming into the world. That makes more sense. It's not about knowledge per se, but the experience of the light entering in the world. And notice the emphasis here. He lights every man, not just the Jews, right? And that's a theme of the word world that we'll see, cosmos, throughout the book of John, is that Yeshua didn't just come for the Jews, but the Gentiles as well. So he's lighting every man, not just the Jews. And so this is you start to snowball into this idea of who it is that Yeshua came for. Okay. Next, we see that verse 5 and 9, if you look at verse 5 and 9, they are very similar in what they're saying, and there's a reason for this. They're very similar, and they're both ambiguous. They're both kind of putting, like, it kind of make you think, it's like John is giving you these little snippets because he wants to make you hungry to read more. And so we're going to keep reading to figure out what John is trying to communicate here. But we know that the light, life, and darkness is a major theme so far. Okay? But when we get to the next section, my favorite section, we'll see a different theme going on. All right, continue on. He was in the world, and the world was made, and again atah, through him. And the world did not know him. Okay, so let's think about this, what John is trying to say so far. Even though the word, or the light, is in the world, and even though the word was made through him, and even though the world enlightens every man, the world failed to recognize him. Right? We just read this earlier. The darkness, there's a conflict. Why doesn't the darkness come to? The question is why. Well, we're going to answer that why later on, but as we go through the book of John. But keep that in the back of your mind. Why doesn't darkness just simply submit to the light? It seems like it's a very sensible thing to do, but why is that the case? We'll find out later. Notice here, we'll continue on, it says, but as many as received him. So, again, this is another theme of the book of John. If you look at the first 12 chapters of the book of John, right, he came to his own, and his own did not receive him. But then you look at the next half of the book of John, but the many as received him, when he's talking to the disciples. Remember how we just divided the book into two sections? The disciples, he spends the last 7 days of his life with the disciples doing private ministry with him, and they received him, they believe in him. So this is a kind of a little summary of the book of John as well. But when it says here, he came unto his own, when he came into his own, the word there is neuter. So some scholars try to say when he came to his own place or he came to his own home. In other words, he came to Judea where he should have been felt at home among his people. That's what they're trying to say. It possibly can refer to that. When he came to his own did not receive him. In what way did not receive him? What does it mean to receive Yeshua here? To believe in him, right? To accept what he has to say, accept who he is as the light. They didn't receive him. So his own is referring to the Jewish people, right? He came to, even though he created the whole world, his own is specifically his own place to the Jewish people, and his own rejected him. The question is why? We'll talk about that later, okay? So here we see that whose name, this is something that I found recently, whose name do those who believe, because remember, believe and receive are the same thing, right? To receive Yeshua is to believe, right? That's what John's trying to say. But whose name, according to the text, read the text carefully, whose name are they believing in? Are you sure? Read it carefully. Because remember how language works. The pronoun follows the last antecedent, which is what? Which is who? Who? It's God. Right? Because God is mentioned, right? It says here, they gave the right to be children of God, even to them who believe on his name. But wait a minute. But I'm confused. Whose name are they believing in? Are they believing in God's name? But what does it mean to receive Yeshua? To believe on him. So is this another reference to being Yeshua's God here? His name, maybe? Right? So this idea then, so what I'm saying is that when we read the passage, we're so used to reading these things that we're not stopping to see his name. And remember, name in Hebrew represents what? Name in Hebrew represents the person or the character of a person. So you're believing on the character of not the Father, but the Son, which must be God, because God is the only perfect character out there. He's the only idea of perfection. Okay. So is it the Father's name or the Son's name that we believe in? The answer is yes, because remember the book of Matthew. It says baptizing in the name of what? The Father, Son, and Spirit. All three divine persons share the same singular name of God. So you see how that works? Baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit. So one name, three persons. So let's break down this. Because verse 13 really throws people for a loop. What is verse 13 trying to say? It's saying that, let's go back to 12, right? He gave the right to become children of God, even those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. What does that mean? So I was doing a lot of searching, looking at the Greek and looking at scholars, what they're saying of this. And it seems this is the conclusion that I think that makes most sense. It fits with the book of John, and it fits what the context is trying to say here. So let's break it down. Okay? Believing children of God are what? Are not born of blood. Literally in the Greek is bloods, plural. So what does that make a reference to? They're not born of ancestral descent. In other words, they can't say, well, Abraham's my father, so therefore I'm a child of God because Abraham's my father. Nope, that's not how it works, right? So Abraham, you can't look at your ancient ancestor and say, well, my ancestry is what makes me in. Nope. So I think that's what he means by bloods here. What else does he mean when he says the will of the flesh? Natural birth. You can't be naturally born as a child of God, right? You can't just simply, okay, I'm born in, my parents, snip, I'm born, I'm part of the covenant, I'm in. No, you can't rely upon that either. But then it says, nor of the will of man. What does that, how can that be related to being born? Well, I think this makes more sense. We look at it this way, a chosen adoption. In other words, when a father decides to adopt a particular child or bring him into his family, he is now considered his son, right? He's legally his son. But that is not how one is coming to in other words, just because somebody's adopted into a Jewish family, per se, doesn't make them a son of God or children of God. So how can we sum up these three things? We can look at it this way. So they're not born by any human agency, power, or will. So you're born of God, not because of anything you can do or anything you can rely upon, anything that's of man. But then how then are we born? If it's not of man, how is it by? But of God. Okay? So again, this is a theme, again, a major theme that we're going to see about the book of John. Now, let me be very clear here. What is this referring to? Predestination, okay? This is obviously what it has to be referring to. It is God who borns us, who makes us his, okay? And so this is, again, we're going to see this again in John chapter 3. We'll see this again in John chapter 10, John chapter 8, John chapter 6, John chapter 17. We'll see this over and over again. We'll see this come up and again. But I wanted to show you that it's actually in 1 John as well, or John chapter 1, excuse me. It's even actually in the book of 1 John as well, which we'll get to there sometime. Okay? So we finished the first two sections. Now, how much time do we have to finish the second section? Oh boy. Okay. All right. So this is the section that I think is going to be a lot of. I'm going to try to calm myself when we go through this section. Okay. All right. All right. John chapter 1, verses 14 and 18. And the Word became flesh, and he tabernacled among us, and we saw his glory, the glory as of the one and only from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified about him and cried out, saying, This was he of whom I said, He who comes after me is higher ranked than I, for he existed before me. For of his fullness we have all received from grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth was realized through Messiah Yeshua. No one has seen God at any time. The one and only God who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. Wow. Now, there's a lot in this section. Okay? A lot. Well, the first thing I want to immediately point to is the word word. This is the first time that John says the word word since John 1:1. Okay? Or John 1:2. So what is he saying interesting about the word here? The word became flesh. Geneta. So all this other time he's been using the word was, and. Now the word became something. The word wasn't this before. It entered into creation. It became flesh. This should be shocking to a lot of Greek readers. The word became flesh. Now when it says became flesh, it doesn't mean he became a person. That's not what it means. He became a man. He became human. So if he became human, he wasn't a human before, right? And so we can talk about the hypostatic union and how that works. We're not going to get into that today too much. But the idea is that he became flesh. Flesh is a big thing throughout the book of John, right? This flesh, that he became physical. Remember, he was battling the Gnostics, pre-Gnostics, the belief that Yeshua just came as an illusion. That he didn't really come in the flesh. It just looked like he came in the flesh. Because remember, from the Gnostics' perspective, the flesh was an evil thing. Anything physical was evil. And so John is pointing the gun right at Gnosticism and saying, the word became flesh. He became physical. Because he wasn't physical before. Okay? So that's the first thing. Next thing it says, and he tabernacled among us. Literally it says he tented among us. And he dwelt among us. That's the idea. And it says, we saw his glory, the glory of the one who begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, I have a question for everybody. I want you to think about this for 1 second. Whose glory did John see? Whose glory did John see? Thank you. What does it say? And we saw his glory, meaning the Word, the glory of the one and only from the Father. So it's not the Father's glory, it's the Son's glory. Is that clear? Okay. I want to make sure that is perfectly clear, because I don't want any confusion later on. And we saw his glory. And what does this glory have? Grace and truth. It doesn't simply have grace and truth. It says it's full of grace and truth. Now, fullness is making reference to what? What is the fullness making reference to? The glory. So within the glory of the Son, it has this in it, grace and truth. And we see this later on in verse 16 because John tries to take a pause here, and he starts talking about John the Baptist. Right in the middle of this, he's about to get into something really good, and he pauses and talks about John the Baptist. What are you doing, John? What are you doing to me? Right? Why did you stick this in here? Well, we're going to pause that. We'll go down to 16. For of his fullness, what is that again? Grace and truth, the glory, we have all received grace upon grace. So remember, we got to skip over 15 a little bit to get into 16 to understand 16. Now, why does he bring up John here? Well, this is very interesting because he seems to break right into context and starts talking about John. He says here, John testified. Hello, testify, right? He's screaming. Testified about him and cried out saying, this is he. This is him who is greater than I. Why? Why is Yeshua, or the Word, greater than John? Because he was previously always existing before me. See, he's doing that was again. So even though he's flesh, he became flesh, he was always in existence before John. Because remember, John is older than Yeshua physically, right? But Yeshua, he's saying he was before me. He existed before me. I like that word existed. That's literally how it translates the word was there, N. Okay? And then it talks about here, verse 16, for of this fullness we have all received from grace upon grace. What is that, a grace upon grace? Well, literally, if you want to be literally what that means, grace and replacement of grace. Uh-oh. We got some problems. Grace replacing grace? And this is where some people say, look at verse 17, for the law came through Moses, but grace and truth was realized? Agenata? Was realized, came through Messiah Yeshua. So that's the way some people say, you see, Yeshua came to replace the law. That's where some people say. How are we going to understand that? How do we understand light on what John's saying? Then verse 18, it says, no one has seen God at any time. The one and only God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. Now, again, this monogenes is the Greek word for monogenes, the one and unique one, monogenes. Some translations, the only begotten Son, only one and only Son, only begotten. It's a textual variant there. And so I think comparing at the manuscripts, I think it makes more sense to say God there. Of course, when you look at John, which we'll see later, not today, but later on, when you look at John 1 through 18 in a chiastic form, this goes back to John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? This is going back to that as well. He's in the bosom of the Father. It's just repeating John 1:1. He's in the bosom of the Father. He is the one and only God, right? Only one from God kind of thing. The one and unique God. It's repeating that. So how do we understand this idea of the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth was realized through Messiah Yeshua, Lord? Now, before we answer that question, what I want to look at here is, and I just lost it. Where'd it go? It says grace and truth were realized. What was I going to say? Now I lost it. Okay, maybe I'll come back to it. I remember I didn't put it in my notes, so I forgot. Okay, so remember last week how I gave you an assignment? I said, what event is John making reference to here? Right? Did anybody come up with an answer? No? Kind of. This section here, there's these four verses. These four verses, John is making reference to an event that happened in the Tanakh. Just like in Genesis, just like in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, we're saying, that's a reference to Genesis chapter 1, because he's using these words and themes, right? Exodus, somebody's right ahead, right? So let's read. This is great.
Hey, Eric, can I ask a quick question? So that grace upon grace thing, you lose me a little bit when you say grace replaces grace.
That's literally what the Greek says.
Oh.
Okay. What does that mean? So let's figure out what that means.
All right. Thank you.
All right, so the question is, what event in the Tanakh is John making reference to? What? The giving of the law on Mount Sinai? No. Something better than that. You ready? No. Sorry. All right, let's look at John. Before we get there, let's look at this. And the word became flesh and tabernacled among us. This is making reference to Exodus chapter 25, verses 6 to 9. This is God saying, have them make a sanctuary for me that I may dwell among them. So who's going to dwell among them in Exodus? God is. God is going to dwell among them. But John says it's Yeshua that dwelled among them. What does that say about Yeshua? Right. Yeshua, yeah, his flesh. Yeah, he's the flesh, right? He became flesh. The flesh is what's the tabernacle is what you see, or the sanctuary. The tabernacle is what you see. But what's dwelling inside the tabernacle? God's presence, right? God's presence, right? Does everyone see that? So when he became flesh, he was able to tabernacle among us. So that his flesh, his physical body, was the tabernacle, but inside Yeshua was what? The very presence of God. Okay? Yep. Somebody's read John, right? So it says here, so have them make a sanctuary for me that I may dwell among them. You are to make it precisely according to everything that I show you, the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of the furnishings, so just as you must make it. So this is the idea, is that the purpose of the tabernacle was so God can dwell amongst the people. That was the purpose of it. And so Yeshua is this tabernacle that's made flesh. Okay? That's not even the good part. All right? So again, what event is John making reference to? No, that is incorrect. It's not the dedication of the temple. Here it is. Oh, I'm going to skip that part. Okay. Exodus 33 and 34. You ready? Here it is. After the sin of the golden calf, Moses goes up to the mountain and he goes to plead on Israel's behalf. Right? And he's going to intercede. And this is the conversation that happens. And Adonai said to Moses, leave, go out of this place. You and the people that you have been brought out of the land of Egypt, head into the land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not move within the midst of you, so that I do not destroy you along the way, for you are stiff-necked people. So what does that mean? So just taking it as face value, what does that mean about the tabernacle? There's no tabernacle anymore. I'm done. Right? I'm not going to move in the midst of you. I'm not going to dwell in the midst of Israel as they travel to the land. Right? That's what that means. And then, just for a few verses later, it's the story stops, and it gives a story of the tent of meeting. That Moses took this tent and he brought it far outside the tent, outside the camp, to talk to God. So let's read some verses. Now Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp, far off from the camp. And he called the tent of meeting. Called it the tent of meeting. Now, what's interesting about it is, in the Greek, in the Septuagint, it's called the tent of witness, the tent of testimony. Interesting, and we see this when in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is talking, he talks about the tent of testimony. That's what he calls it. It's a testimony. It's testifying about something. Have you heard that word recently? About testifying? Okay. After Moses entered, a pillar of cloud descended and stood at the door, and he would speak with Moses. So Adonai spoke with Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend. Face to face. Okay. So it says a pillar of cloud. Now, what is this pillar of cloud that stood before the tent of meeting? It's God's presence. Everyone see that? God's presence, the Shekinah glory before God. Okay. So now we're going to skip ahead a few more verses and continue on the narrative that was interrupted. So Moses, verse 12. So Moses said to Adonai, you say to me, bring up these people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you said, I know you by name, and you have found grace in my eyes. Now, what does it mean to know by name? Does it mean a simple knowledge? from the Hebrew perspective, to know somebody by name is to have a relationship with them, right? To know them by name, because God knows everyone by name, but not in a relationship sense. Verse 13, now then I pray, if I have found grace in your eyes, show me your ways, so that I may know you, and that I might have found grace in your sight. Consider also that this nation is your people. My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest, he answered, meaning God answered. This is what God is saying to Moses. So Moses was able to convince God to go with them, bring his presence along to the promised land, right? Okay.
Eric, who's Adonai? Is that God the Father, God the Son?
It's God.
It's God, the Godhead.
Yes. It's God.
Elohim.
Right? Okay. We'll get there. So it says, but then he said to him, this is God saying to Moses, but he said to him, this is Moses saying to God. But he said to him, if your presence does not go with me, don't let us go out from here. For how will it be known that I and your people have found grace in your sight? Isn't it because you go with us that distinguishes us from all the peoples on the face of the earth? Adonai answered Moses, I will also do this thing you have said, for you have found grace in my sight, and I know you by name. So remember, it's because of what Moses did on behalf of the people, his relationship with God, that God decided to bring his presence with them, okay? Everyone see it yet? Nobody sees it yet. Okay, here we go. Then he says, Moses asked him a question. What question does Moses ask God? What question? This is it, guys. What question does he ask him? Show me your glory. Right? Show me your glory. Why does he say that? Of all the questions you can ask God, why would you ask him to say, show me your glory? Because his glory is his presence. Right? Okay. Show me your glory. Show me your glory. Then he said to him, I will cause my goodness, his goodness is his glory, right? I will show my goodness to pass before you and call out the name of Adonai before you, meaning the name of the Lord, Yahweh, the Hashem. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show compassion, or I'll be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy to whom I will show mercy. Now, I can talk about that all day long. We're going to skip over that for now. We'll talk about that later. But he said to him, you cannot see my face, for no one can see my face and live. You guys see it yet? You will.
Hold on.
Okay.
Hold on 1 minute. Hold on a second. It just said he spoke to him face to face as man
one speaks to a friend. Right, not that he really saw his face. So it's a euphemism to say as how he was able to relationally talk to him, not actually see his face. I know where you're going with that. Okay,
I'm not going anywhere. I'm just asking a question.
He spoke to face to face and explains to it as one talks to a friend, not that he actually saw his face. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that a little more later if you want. But yeah, because that's a euphemism to saying it's a euphemism. Go ahead. What were you gonna say?
I'm gonna leave this one alone. I don't want to get into
Okay. All right. Let's keep going. All right. Then it says here, verse 21, and Adonai said, see, a place near me, you will stand on the rock while my glory passes by. Whose glory, by the way, was this? Adonai's glory, right? Okay. Making sure. While the glory passed by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock and cover you with my hand until I pass by, and I will take away my hand that you will see my back, but my face cannot be seen. Okay, ready? Now chapter 34. Here we go. Adonai said to Moses, carve for yourself 2 tablets of stone like the first ones, and I will write them upon my words that were on the first tablets, which you broke, by the way, because the sin of the golden calf, right? Be ready in the morning, come up to Mount Sinai, and present yourself to me there on top of the mountain. Verse 4. So he carved 2 tablets of stone like the first. Then Moses rose up early in the morning onto the Mount Sinai as Adonai had commanded him, and took in his hand 2 tablets of stone. Right? No. No. What? No. It's not Shavuot. No. No, here, we're gonna see here. This is exciting. Okay, so look, but remember, what is Moses doing here? He's renewing the covenant because the Israel broke it, and God was gonna say, I don't want to go with you people. Moses says, no, you must, because I found favor in your sight. He goes, okay, fine, I'll go with you. Now that I'm gonna go with you, I'm gonna rewrite the Torah that came through Moses, right? Okay, come up here. Now, when he gets up here, what's gonna happen? Here, you ready? And he says, then Adonai descended, and he came down in the cloud and stood with him there as he called the name of Adonai. And Adonai passed before him and proclaimed, Adonai, Adonai, Yahweh, Yahweh, Hashem, Hashem. A compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abundant in what? Love and kindness. What is that? Grace and truth. And where did we see that at? Yeshua in John chapter 1, he was full of grace and truth. So whose glory did Moses see? Hashem's. Whose glory did John see? Yeshua's. Are they the same glory or different glory? They're the same glory. Wow. They're the same glory. We're not done. We're not done. Showing mercy to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity and transgression of sin, yet by no means leaving the guilty unpunished, and bringing the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, upon the children's children for the third or fourth generations. This is what we call the 13 attributes of God. And notice these are all actions of God. God does these actions, and Jews is called the 13 attributes of God. But we're not done yet. The story is not finished. We're going down to verse 20. So Moses stayed with Adonai for 40 days and 40 nights, and he did not eat bread nor drink water. He wrote on the tablets of the words of the covenant, the 10 words. Right? Now it happened, after 40 days and 40 nights, Moses comes down from the mountain of Sinai with the 2 tablets of testimony in his hand, singular, one hand, and he came down from the mountain, and Moses did not know that the skin of his face was radiant. Everyone remember this story? On the New Covenant story? You know where I'm going with this? Because God had spoken with him. When Aaron and Ben Israel saw the face of Moses, his skin of his face was shown, they were afraid to come near to him. But then what happened? But Moses called to them and said, hey, it's me. So Aaron and all the rulers of the congregation returned to him, and Moses spoke to them. Afterwards, Ben Israel came near, and he gave them all the mitzvot that Adonai had spoken to him on Mount Sinai. When Moses was done speaking to them, he put a veil over his face. Remember the whole thing with veil, taking the veil off? What does that mean? And where does Paul talk about this veil being put on Moses' face and his face showing? What does he talk about that? 1 Corinthians chapter 3. And who does Paul say that this glory's face that came from Moses, who does he identify it as? Yeshua. The Yeshua is the glory that's coming from Moses' face. Whose glory did Moses see on top of Mount Sinai? He's showing Yeshua's glory. Because remember, you can't see God's face and live, but you can see my back. My visible part. And who's the visible manifestation of God? Yeshua. You see that? So let's go back to John. And the Word became flesh. And he tabernacled among us, and we beheld. Now, the word saw his glory is a really bad translation. It literally means we beheld in awe. We beheld his glory. His glory, the one and only from the Father, full of grace and truth. And Adonai descended from the clouds, Exodus 34, and Adonai passed before him, saying, Adonai, Adonai, compassionate, gracious God, slow to anger, full of grace and truth. We're not done. Then it says, which one? Right here? Okay. Then it says here, for of his fullness we all receive from grace, replacing grace, or grace upon grace. What is he making reference to there? Well, Moses tells us in Exodus 34:13, it says, now then I pray, if I have found grace in your eyes, if I have found, past tense, show me your ways so that I may know you, so that I might find grace in your eye. What? I thought you've already found grace in your sight. Why do you need if I found grace in your eyes, why do you need to be shown that you have found grace in his eyes? Because one is an expression of, God says grace, but here's the proof of it. One is the proof, one's just simply an expression of it. Right? Grace upon grace. One is spoken, one is a demonstration of it. Right? Okay. No one has seen God at any time, including Moses. The one and only God who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. Literally, he has exegeted him. He has made him known. Why is it only that the Word or the Son can make the Father known? Why is that the case? Because he's the only one in the bosom of the Father. He's the only one that has been in the presence of him for all eternity, as we see in John chapter 1. Right? So Moses couldn't do that. Moses couldn't see. He could only see only the back, what John saw, which was Yeshua, the manifestation of God's presence in the tabernacle in the flesh. Right, it's always been so. No one has seen God at any time, but yet who wrestled with Jacob? Who did Abraham eat lunch with? Who did they see when they went to Mount Sinai to make the covenant ceremony? The 70 elders and Aaron and Moses and Joshua. When they went up to Mount Sinai, they said they saw the God of Israel. Yet no one has seen God at any time. What is John making reference to? He's making reference to Yeshua. They saw Yeshua there. So I have a question. I have a question for you, for everybody. When Yeshua became flesh, is he still flesh today? What do you think? At the end of the book of Revelation, remember, because Revelation and John are together, right? At the end of the book of Revelation, he says, I am the root and branch of David. He just says, I was the root and branch of David. I am the root and branch. What does it mean to be he's the branch? He's a descendant of David. No, he's physically, really, still a descendant of David because he's still in the flesh. That's just one, right? He's the root, meaning he's the originator of David, and he's the branch of David too. He's both the eternal and the temporal at the same time. Is what he's trying to communicate there. That's just one example. 1 John gives lots of other examples as well.
I'm just saying.
Here's another proof. Better. It says, why is Yeshua the perfect mediator? Why is Yeshua the perfect mediator? Because he's both God and man. The man, what does Paul say in Timothy? He says, and there's only one mediator between God and man, the man, Messiah Yeshua. Right? So he has to be a man. So let me ask you this. Is there ever going to be a time when Yeshua will not be a man? No. So you mean to tell me that God loved us so much that he was willing for all eternity to be in the flesh forever? Think about that for a second. He says, I will become a flesh and I will dwell with my children or my family forever in this flesh. That's what it means. Think about the love that he would willing to put himself, he subject himself to for all eternity. That's just something to think about. There's two things I want to go over about John 14 through 18 real quick. One, this term grace and truth. This term grace and truth is found throughout the Tanakh, and it's found as a pair in reference to covenantal faithfulness. All right, I can give you other references if you want later, but there are a ton of references. Grace and truth, or loving kindness and truth. I forgot the exact Hebrew words, but it's referring to God's covenantal faithfulness. So he is full of covenantal faithfulness because he's coming to, and that's exactly what Moses was doing, right? God was being faithful to the covenant, and he remade the Ten Commandments, the renewing the covenant, and that God is full of grace and truth. The other thing here is looking at verse 17. Then how should we understand verse 17? When it says here, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth was realized through Messiah Yeshua. So how do we understand that? Well, we have to understand it based on what happened the verse before it, right? For of his fullness, meaning grace and truth, we have all received, right? Grace on top of grace, or grace in place of grace, however you want to translate that. But that again, that is the idea is that Moses, giving the Torah of Moses was grace. Why? Why was the giving of the Torah grace? Because it pointed to Yeshua, who was where the grace and truth or the covenant of faithfulness is actually realized in him. So it's not that he's replacing the law of Moses, he's complementing the law of Moses. In the same way, early in the book of John, where it talks about John came to testify of the true light, right? The same way Moses testifies of Yeshua, who is it's realized. So that's the idea. So, and some translations, I know in the King James, but in other translation, it reads this way: "For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth was." But there's no "but" in the Greek. That's been added by the English translators, right? So we have to be careful. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth was realized. It came to be. It came to fruition, not through the law. The law doesn't bring the covenant of faithfulness. Only the Son makes it realized. So whenever somebody brings up that verse, I know there was a question before, how do we understand this verse as far as the Torah is concerned? That's how looking at it in context, especially what it's making reference to, we can see very clearly. And of course, in case I didn't make it clear before, no one has seen God at any time. That's what God said to Moses: "You cannot see me and live." So who did he see? He saw Yeshua. Okay. I think that covers everything that I wanted to say about this. So what I'm going to do for next time, I'm going to print this out for you, but these are the lists of, I can bring it up here, because we don't have time to go. But what we're going to do is I'm going to take this list here, and basically what I do is I took out all the themes out of the first 18 verses, and I put them in this list. And so every time we finish a section or we finish a chapter, we're going to look at this and we're going to see what was that chapter making reference to in the book of John 1. Okay? So like, for example, when we get to John chapter 3, we talk about being born again, right? Well, we'll look down here where it says here, those believing are children born of God, right? So that links back to John 1. Oh, then we'll get to John chapter 5. We'll see here, the Word is God, he as nature and his action, because he's doing the same action as the Father. So we'll go back there, and we're going to see this pattern, because this is going to help us interpret some problem passages that at the face of it might seem like it's saying something else, but in reality it's saying something that's opposite of that, because we're looking at it through this lens. Does that make sense? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to print this out next time, and we'll have it as we go through each section. All right? All right. I know we went long enough. Does anybody have other final questions or comments before we move on? Okay. We're only in chapter 1.
Chapter 1 in the books.
Okay. All right. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for today. Thank you so much for giving us your word that we can study. Thank you so much for sending Yeshua. Thank you for letting us see your glory in him, and that you dwell among us, in our hearts and in our congregation. We just ask you to continue to be with us. May we not offend you. May we keep your commandments and glorify you in all that you do. In Yeshua's name we pray. Amen.